There are places in the world where time stands still, where the breath of the ancient spirit still lingers among stones and scrolls. It was in one of these places, in the sacred mountains of Ethiopia, that my journey began. In 1998, I traveled to Addis Ababa. It was not an ordinary trip. It was a calling, a subtle but persistent whisper from within. There is more to the Christ than what men have been told. I carried with me my thirst for symbols, my lifelong desire to understand not the Jesus of institutions, but the living Christ who speaks to the depths of the human psyche. I had heard rumors among monks and local scholars. They spoke of a hidden manuscript, a millennia-old text preserved by a lineage of faith untouched by Rome. They claimed it recorded words spoken by Jesus after his resurrection, teachings never read in the West. Why did this stir me so deeply? Because as a psychologist of the soul, I've always known true transformation does not occur in birth, but in rebirth. And what remains most obscure in the canonical Gospels is precisely what Jesus taught after he overcame death. What would he say to his disciples after the trauma of the cross? How would he guide them now that the veil of existence had been torn? Ethiopia holds more than ancient landscapes. It holds a forgotten wisdom, a spiritual memory that was never tamed by councils or rewritten by empires. There I encountered not merely a text, but a mirror for the soul. This video is the account of that search, not from a theologian nor a historian, but from a man who dared to descend into the caves of consciousness and ascend the mountains of spirit. If you've ever felt that something essential was missing from the official stories, if the image of a meek, domesticated Christ has never fully resonated with you, then walk with me. What lies ahead is not just an archaeological discovery. It is an invitation to awaken. Most people believe the Bible is one fixed universal book, but this is an illusion. The Bible, as known in the West, is a product of selection shaped by councils, emperors, and politics. What we call canon was not chosen by divine decree, but by men who feared what certain texts could awaken in the human soul. In Ethiopia, I found a different Bible, one Rome never read. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest Christian traditions on earth, preserves 81 books in its biblical canon, compared to the 66 of the Protestant Bible or the 73 of the Catholic. These extra books were not heresies, they were simply left behind. Why? Because they are dangerous. Not in a literal sense, but psychologically. They speak directly to the inner transformation of the human being, and not to obedience, guilt, or external authority. Some of these books were written in Ge'ez, a sacred language as old and mysterious as Latin or Hebrew. Within them I discovered detailed accounts of the 40 days Jesus spent with his disciples after the resurrection, a period the canonical Gospels largely ignore. And here lies the mystery. Why would such a critical time, the moment after death has been conquered, be treated as a mere footnote in the West? In the Ethiopian texts, these 40 days are central. Jesus does not disappear. He teaches, he warns, he reveals the architecture of spirit and the hidden forces that would soon distort his message. Ethiopia's geographic and cultural isolation preserved these teachings. Protected by mountains guarded by monks, these manuscripts were not subject to the revisions of Rome or Constantinople. Reading them, I felt I was hearing the voice of Christ anew, unfiltered, undomesticated, burning with existential clarity. This is not the Christ of cathedrals. This is not the Christ of gold and ritual. This is the Christ who speaks directly to the soul. The Bible Rome never read may be the one the soul has always longed for. I remember the rope. Worn by centuries of hands, it hung down the face of a sheer sandstone cliff. There were no stairs, no gates, only this rope and the silence of the mountain. To reach the monastery of Debre Damo, one must climb. No woman has ever been permitted to enter, and no man ascends without effort. I was nearly 60 then. My hands trembled. My heart beat not from fear, but reverence. This was no tourist path. It was a pilgrimage. At the summit, a stone compound revealed itself, timeless and austere. Mud brick walls, wooden beams blackened by age, and eyes, the kind that have seen beyond history, watching quietly. The abbot greeted me with the dignity of one who carries something eternal. He knew why I had come. No words were wasted. After a humble meal, he led me into a small, dark chamber. There it was. A bundle of parchment, wrapped in cloth. The Metsafe Kid. The Book of the Covenant. A manuscript no scholar in the West had touched. Written in Ge'ez, preserved by memory and prayer. As I opened its fragile pages, I felt as though I were trespassing into a dream the world had tried to forget. Symbols older than Europe. Names unspoken for centuries. And between the lines, silence. The kind that speaks louder than any sermon. The abbot began to translate. Slowly. Carefully. His voice trembled. The text described Jesus, risen and luminous, appearing to his disciples in secret places, caves, mountaintops, gardens. He spoke of inner light, of false teachers to come, of temples built in his name that would betray his essence, not with hatred, but with power, gold, and fear. It was not blasphemy, it was clarity. I felt something shift in me, a veil lifted. For a moment, I glimpsed a Christ no longer bound to religion, but alive in the raw territory of the soul. I had climbed a mountain to find a manuscript, but in truth, I had descended into the deep well of the human psyche. And there Christ waited, not as a doctrine, but as an experience. He did not speak like a man returning from death. He spoke like one who had always been beyond it. The Metsafe Kid revealed dialogues I had never encountered in any gospel, words of Jesus spoken in those 40 hidden days after the resurrection. Not parables, not public sermons, but intimate conversations with his disciples, filled with urgency, depth, and luminous authority. He warned them, "Soon men will build temples in my name, but I will not dwell there." He foresaw, "They will wear robes and crowns, but their hearts will be empty." These were not the gentle teachings of the Galilean healer. These were the words of a Christ who had passed through death and returned disillusioned, not with humanity, but with what would be done in his name. He spoke of a time when his message would be buried under rituals, distorted by power, and sold as comfort. "The truth is a sword," he said, "not a pillow." As I listened to the monk read, a strange grief stirred in me, not sorrow for Christ, but for us, for how we had taken a teaching meant to liberate the soul and turned it into a system meant to contain it. These lost words were not revolutionary in the political sense. They were revolutionary to the inner world. Christ was not inciting rebellion against Rome. He was calling for rebellion against inner slavery, fear, conformity, illusion. He instructed his disciples to become seekers of truth beyond dogma, to recognize the divine not in buildings or books, but in the stillness of the heart and the awakening of the mind. In these words, I heard a voice strikingly close to the mystics, to the Gnostics, and even to the path of individuation I had spent my life studying. A Christ who points inward, not outward. A Christ who does not ask for worship, but for awakening. These texts were not merely suppressed, they were feared, because they dared to declare that no institution, not even the church, could stand between the soul and the divine. And perhaps that is the most dangerous truth of all. There is a strange gap in the canonical Gospels. Jesus rises from the dead, and then almost nothing. A few appearances, a breakfast by the sea, a final blessing. Then he vanishes into the clouds. But 40 days is a long time. The Ethiopian manuscripts fill that silence, not with spectacle, but with initiation. They describe Jesus teaching daily, sometimes in caves, sometimes in solitude, preparing his disciples not to lead a religion, but to become vessels of consciousness. He spoke not of kingdoms or commandments, but of the soul, the spirit, and the transformation of inner being. He taught that the resurrection was not only his, it was a model for each human soul. "What is dead in you must die again," he said, "and what is buried must be brought into the light." I recognized this pattern. It is the same movement I observed in dreams, in myths, in the alchemical journey of individuation, descent, disintegration, and rebirth. The path of the wounded healer, not saved by dogma, but through the fire of self-confrontation. These 40 days were a spiritual passage. Christ no longer spoke to the crowd. He whispered to the few, to those ready to see. He spoke of the architecture of the self, of how thoughts become spirits, how desires take form, how suffering opens the gate to the eternal. He revealed that the battle was no longer outside, but within, a war between the true self and the masks we wear to survive. And yet these teachings never made it into the Western canon. Why? Because they did not serve empire, because they did not create order. They created freedom. Reading them, I understood. The Christ of the 40 days was not meant to build a church. He was meant to awaken a fire in the individual, a light that could not be controlled, taxed, or sealed in doctrine. These lost teachings are not just religious. They are deeply psychological. They invite us to ask, what remains asleep in me? What truth have I buried? And who might I become if I dared to resurrect? No empire fears gods. Empires fear free souls. As I studied the lost words of the risen Christ, preserved in the Ethiopian texts, one question grew louder in my mind. Why were these teachings silenced? The answer is not theological, it is psychological and political. The Christ of the canonical Gospels is already powerful, but the Christ of the 40 days is unmanageable. He offers no structure, no rules for hierarchy, no blueprint for control. Instead, he points inward, to conscience, to presence, to a truth that requires no mediator. To an empire like Rome, built on command and obedience, such a vision was intolerable. When Christianity became the religion of the state under Constantine, something profound shifted. The spiritual fire that had burned in hidden rooms and desert caves was reshaped into a system, creeds, rituals, bishops, and walls. The mystery became a mechanism. The rebel became a ruler. But the Ethiopian manuscripts tell a different story, one the councils did not canonize. In them, Jesus warns his disciples, "They will use my name to build thrones. They will wear my cross like a crown, but forget the burden it carries." He saw what would come: temples of marble, sermons of fear, and an institution more concerned with power than with truth. He prophesied not only betrayal but transformation, not of the soul but of his message. 3 reasons stand out for the suppression of these teachings. Control, a direct connection between soul and spirit, removes the need for priesthood and empire. Reason, the mystical language of inner transformation, threatened the Greco-Roman craving for order, logic, and external authority. Fear, a church built on inner awakening cannot be taxed, ruled, or standardized. The Christ that Rome embraced was a Christ reduced, made safe for civilization. But the Christ they feared was still wild, still burning with the chaos of truth. He did not come to found a religion. He came to ignite a revolution of the soul, and for that reason, he had to be buried again. This time, not in a tomb of stone, but beneath centuries of silence. The voice I heard in those ancient pages was not bitter. It was heartbroken. Jesus, risen from the dead, looked not with anger, but with sorrow toward the future. He saw what would become of the movement born in love. He foresaw how the sacred would be used as armor, not to protect the soul, but to control the many. There will be temples built of gold, he warned, but the hearts within them will be hollow. The Ethiopian manuscripts do not speak in riddles, they are clear, almost painfully so. Jesus names what will come: a church of wealth, obsessed with image, forgetting the spirit. He speaks of priests who sell salvation, of doctrines that strangle rather than free, of rituals performed without soul, and most hauntingly he says, "They will speak my name, but not know me." Reading these words, I felt a deep unease, not as a critic of religion, but as a man of the soul. I have seen what happens when spiritual symbols are emptied of meaning. They become masks, tools of shame, weapons of guilt. The Christ of these texts does not reject community, nor does he despise tradition. But he calls out falsehood with fierce clarity. He sees that the greatest danger to his message would not be outside enemies, but those within his own house. And has it not happened? We have cathedrals built on suffering, ministries built on fear, and faith sold like merchandise. The divine reduced to performance, the mystery replaced by dogma. The prophecy in these texts is not only historical, it is eternal. It warns each of us, beware when your outer devotion becomes a substitute for inner truth. And it invites us, return, strip away the robes, step out of the temple, look within. This is not a call to abandon belief, but to purify it, to reclaim it, to recognize that the divine was never owned by a church but has always lived quietly in the center of the heart. The question is not whether the church has been corrupted. The question is whether we still have the courage to seek the Christ it tried to bury. It was in Axum, under a sky untouched by modern light, that the silence found me. I had spent weeks among manuscripts, monks, and memories buried deep in the dust of time. But nothing prepared me for that night. I wandered outside the monastery walls, unable to sleep, burdened by the weight of what I had read. The stars above were vast, cold, and brilliant. They seemed to pierce the soul. And then, in the stillness, something shifted. Not a vision, not a voice, a presence. I cannot describe it in rational terms. It was as if the boundary between inner and outer dissolved, as if something greater leaned close, not to impress, but to remind, a whisper from the invisible world. One question echoed within me: will you have the courage to speak what you now know? I stood motionless, not out of fear, but reverence. In that moment I understood. The greatest truths are not merely discovered, they are received, and once received they ask something of you. Responsibility, honesty, risk. This was not just about ancient texts or hidden gospels. It was about the soul's burden once it has seen what lies behind the curtain. The Christ I had encountered in those lost words was not simply a teacher. He was a mirror. And beneath the stars of Axum, I felt what every soul must feel when touched by truth: a trembling, a calling, a choice, to remain silent, or to let the truth speak, no matter the cost. Jesus spoke of things the modern mind dismisses: angels, demons, invisible structures of reality. But in the Ethiopian texts, these are not metaphors. They are dimensions of the psyche, described with clarity and depth. He taught that every thought is a builder, every emotion a current, that what we think becomes what we are, not symbolically but energetically. Your mind shapes the path your soul must walk, he said. What I read was not myth, it was a map of how the inner world shapes the outer, how the invisible governs the visible. He spoke of the soul as a temple, with layers, chambers, thresholds. He revealed how some rooms remain sealed until pain or love unlocks them. This, to me, was not superstition. It was psychological science in sacred language. The angels, he said, are forces of clarity, courage, and remembrance. The demons are not creatures with horns, but inner patterns of fear, falsehood, and inertia. Each human being lives in the tension between these two, and consciousness is the field where this battle unfolds. He warned his disciples, "Guard your thoughts, for they are seeds of reality." And then, the greatest blindness is to believe the world outside is more real than the one within. In this teaching, I saw the roots of what mystics and psychologists alike have always known, that reality is not simply what happens to us, but what we are awake enough to perceive. The architecture of the universe, as he described it, is not out there in the stars. It is within us, built not of stone or time, but of soul. In the West, we were taught to separate spirit from body, to see the flesh as weakness, distraction, even sin. But in the Ethiopian texts, the risen Jesus speaks differently. He teaches that the body is not an obstacle to the divine. It is the vessel, not a prison, but a temple. Do not abandon the body, he says, for it is the lamp of the soul. This struck me deeply. For decades I had studied how the psyche speaks through the body, in dreams, in illness, in instinct. Here Christ was saying the same, that soul and body are not enemies, but partners in awakening. He taught his disciples to pray not just with words, but with breath, to stand, sit, and move in ways that aligned the body with the spirit, not performance, but presence. Let your breath become your prayer, he said. When the breath flows in silence, the soul begins to remember. This is not the external ritual of churches, but an inner liturgy, a worship of stillness, a return to the sacred rhythm of being. The body, he said, carries memory, not just of our life, but of what came before. It holds both trauma and truth. To neglect it is to abandon part of the path. And so he instructed, eat with awareness, walk in silence, touch the earth, listen to the body as you would to a prophet. These teachings are profoundly practical and deeply transformative. Not belief, but embodiment. Not escape from the world, but a deeper presence within it. The temple is not in Jerusalem. It is you. Not all prayer is spoken. Some prayers rise in silence, not from the mouth, but from the deepest center of the being. In the Lost Teachings, Jesus reveals what he calls the prayer of the heart, a practice not of asking, but of remembering. Not a plea to a distant God, but a return to the divine spark already within. He taught, close the eyes, let the breath become still, let the name rise and fall with the rhythm of life. This was not new to me. I had seen it in the Desert Fathers, in the Eastern tradition of hesychasm, in the murmured repetition of the Jesus prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me. But here, in these ancient Ethiopian pages, I saw it taught directly by the risen Christ. He did not demand ritual. He invited presence. When the heart speaks the name in silence, the gates of heaven open, he said. No temple is greater than a heart at rest. He described this prayer as a way of descent, not toward doctrine, but toward essence, a movement inward where breath becomes sacred and awareness becomes communion. There is no audience in this kind of prayer, only presence, only union. I understood then that what he offered was not a religion, but a path to inner stillness, a way to quiet the storms of thought so the whisper of the divine could be heard again. This prayer does not make you righteous. It makes you real. It draws the fragmented self back into one, breath, body, soul, until all becomes one single silent flame. Not for display, but for illumination. Truth does not vanish. It sleeps. It hides in deserts, in silence, in the forgotten corners of the earth. But it cannot die. The final pages of the Ethiopian manuscripts were not confessions, they were prophecies. Jesus told his disciples, when the truth is buried, it becomes a seed, and when the time is right, it will break the ground. He foresaw that his words would be twisted, that men would edit his message, rename it, market it, weaponize it. He did not fear this. He expected it, but he also knew truth returns. It may take centuries, but it returns. The church tried to silence these writings. Councils declared them heretical. Scribes ignored them. And yet, in Ethiopia, monks who had nothing, who lived by candlelight and prayer, preserved them, not for power, for fidelity. The truth survived because someone chose to carry it quietly across time, not in cathedrals but in caves, not with swords, but with devotion. And now, here it is, alive. These pages are not just history, they are a mirror. They show us what happens when institutions try to own the sacred. But more importantly, they show us that truth has no owner. It belongs to the seeker, to the listener, to the one who dares to question, to feel, to remember. Reading those final words, I felt no anger toward the church, only sorrow and a kind of sacred defiance, because no matter how long it takes, the buried truth rises, not to destroy, but to awaken. Not everything that is hidden is lost. Some truths retreat beneath the surface, waiting, not for everyone, but for those who are ready to see. The Christ I encountered in Ethiopia was not the Christ of stained glass or sermons. He was not soft. He was not safe. He was fire. He came not to create believers, but to awaken those willing to die to illusion and be reborn in truth. His words, buried for centuries, now rise like seeds breaking the soil. They do not ask for worship. They ask for transformation, and that is the harder path. To follow this Christ is not to join a group, repeat a creed, or dress the part. It is to confront oneself, to descend into the inner abyss, to strip away comfort and see clearly, even when the truth is uncomfortable, inconvenient, or alone. It takes courage to see, because once you see, you cannot return. The hidden Christ speaks to something ancient in us, the part that still remembers who we were before the world told us who to be, the part that longs for freedom more than safety, for essence more than approval. And so I leave you with this: do not wait for permission to seek the truth. You are the temple. You are the silence. You are the spark. And the Christ that cannot die still waits not in the pages of books or the gold of cathedrals, but in the quiet moment when a soul finally says, "I'm ready to see." The truth does not die. It waits. And when you are ready, it blooms.